Something enormous just happened, and most Americans are not connecting the dots. The United States is currently fighting a war with Iran, a real war, and Washington just picked up the phone and called Moscow, not the other way around. Let that sit for a moment. The world's most powerful military, mid operation, reached out to Vladimir Putin, a man the US has spent years sanctioning, isolating, and condemning because America needs something from Russia right now. That something is restraint. White House envoy Steve Witkoff has already gone on record telling Russian officials directly, do not share intelligence with Iran, do not help them. Meanwhile, oil has smashed past $100 a barrel. The Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed, and Putin is sitting back watching his revenues surge while America bleeds in the Gulf. And here is what nobody in mainstream media wants to say plainly. Putin did not call Trump. Trump called Putin. Washington initiated this. That is not strength. That is a superpower quietly, nervously asking a rival for permission to finish a war it started. The global power map is shifting right now in real time. And most Americans have no idea what that actually means for their economy, their security, and their place in the world order. Now, to understand what is truly happening here, you have to go back not just a few weeks, but decades. You have to understand what kind of relationship Russia and Iran have built with each other, why that relationship exists, and why it matters so deeply to what we are watching unfold right now. Because what is happening between Washington and Moscow over this Iran war is not simply a diplomatic disagreement. It is a window into the entire rearrangement of global power that is taking place in front of our eyes in real time, and most Americans are still not seeing it for what it really is. On February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched surprise airstrikes on multiple sites across Iran, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and dozens of other senior officials in one of the most dramatic opening moves in modern military history. The Trump administration framed it as a necessary, even urgent act. They told the American people that Iran was weeks away from a nuclear weapon. They said there was no choice. They said the window was closing. But here is what they did not say, and what you need to sit with for a moment. Before the bombs fell, there were negotiations happening, indirect talks in Oman, and by multiple accounts, those talks were actually producing results. The mediating Omani foreign minister had stated significant progress, with Iran willing to make concessions, but President Trump said he was not thrilled with the process and walked away from it. He walked away from a negotiating table that was moving and walked toward a war that has now, in just 11 days, cost the United States billions of dollars, 6 American service members' lives, and is sending shockwaves through the global economy that ordinary American families are already beginning to feel at the gas pump and on their grocery receipts. And now, after all of that, the administration is standing in front of cameras asking Russia to stay out of it. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth delivered a pointed message at a Pentagon briefing, making clear that Russia should stay out of the escalating Middle East confrontation, one day after Trump personally called Putin. Think about the sequencing here. America starts a war. Russia, which has deep strategic ties to Iran built over decades, does not simply look away. And then Washington, the country that launched the operation, that made the choice unilaterally, that did not even go to Congress for authorization. That country is now telling Russia what it is and is not allowed to do in response. That is an extraordinary position to find yourself in. And it tells you a great deal about how this administration actually calculated or failed to calculate the downstream consequences of what it set in motion, because here is what Russia has actually been doing. Russia has been providing Iran with targeting information to attack American forces in the Middle East, including the locations of American warships and aircraft. That is not a rumor. That is not a partisan talking point. That is what American officials confirmed to the Washington Post. Russia is feeding coordinates to Iran. Iran is using those coordinates to fire at American assets. And the White House response? White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt claimed that the intelligence sharing was not making any difference with respect to military operations because the US was completely decimating Iran. Now, that is a remarkable statement because what she is essentially saying is yes, our geopolitical rival is actively helping our enemy target our troops and our ships, but it does not matter because we are winning. That is not reassurance, that is spin. And when you hear spin at that level, in that context, you have to ask yourself, what are they not telling us? What they are not telling us is the full depth of the economic catastrophe that this war has triggered. Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, which led Iraq, a major oil producer, to shut down some of its production. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a geography lesson. It is the artery through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes every single day. When Iran announced that closure, oil markets did not just move, they convulsed. Oil and gas prices surged to their highest levels in over a year, higher than when President Trump took office. Stock markets fell, and this is all in the first week. Think about what the compounding effect of weeks or months of this looks like for the American family that is already stretched thin. Think about what it means for the truck driver, the small business owner, the family heating their home, the farmer depending on fuel costs to make their harvest pencil out. This war is not happening somewhere distant from American daily life. It is landing directly in American wallets, and Putin understands this perfectly. In fact, Putin may understand it better than anyone in Washington does. Because here is the thing about Russia's position in this moment that most mainstream commentary completely misses. Russia could actually benefit economically from the attack on Iran if countries turn to Russia for oil. Read that again. The country that Washington is now calling and pleading with to stay out of this conflict is the same country that stands to make enormous amounts of money the longer this conflict disrupts Middle Eastern oil supply. Putin is not simply a neutral observer being asked to show restraint. Putin is a player who profits from the chaos, and he knows it. And you can be almost certain that Trump knows it too, which is why that phone call happened the way it did. Trump called Putin, not the other way around. Washington needed something, and Moscow, as always, is happy to let Washington need things and see what it can extract in return. Now, let us be clear about what Russia has not done, because being accurate here matters. Russia has been watching largely from the sidelines. Putin issued a condolence letter following the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, but Russia has not stepped into the fighting, nor has Iran asked for that kind of help, according to the Kremlin. So Russia is playing a very careful, very deliberate game. It is providing intelligence, which is serious, which directly endangers American lives, but it is not putting Russian boots, Russian jets, or Russian missiles into this fight. Why? Because Russia is not foolish enough to get into a direct military confrontation with the United States while it is still grinding through its war in Ukraine. Moscow's next steps will likely be calibrated to uphold its credibility as a counter-Western partner, but avoid being drawn into a second high-intensity conflict. Russia wants the leverage. Russia wants the economic windfall from rising oil prices. Russia wants to complicate Washington's military operations just enough to be useful to Iran and damaging to America, without crossing the threshold that would bring it into direct conflict with NATO. That is a very sophisticated position, and it should worry Americans far more than the administration's current public messaging suggests. Here is something else the American public deserves to understand: the question of why Trump launched this war when he did, and why he abandoned the negotiations that were, by independent accounts, showing real progress, has not been answered. It is difficult to accept at face value that negotiations with Iran had no chance of succeeding on the nuclear issue, given that the same administration and the same two negotiators showed unlimited patience and marked willingness to compromise when it came to Russia and its aggression against Ukraine. That is a profoundly important observation. The same Steve Witkoff who was in those Iran talks is the same Steve Witkoff who has been the administration's primary back channel to Putin on Ukraine. The same White House that told Americans Iran had to be bombed immediately because diplomacy was exhausted has spent months and months patiently, gently, softly negotiating with Russia, a country that invaded its neighbor, committed documented atrocities, and has been providing targeting intelligence to help kill Americans. The asymmetry of patience here is not a coincidence. It is a policy, and it is a policy that the American public has a right to interrogate, because what this asymmetry reveals is a hierarchy of relationships inside this White House that determines how conflicts get managed. Russia gets patience, flexibility, and direct presidential calls. Iran got bombs, and you have to ask, why? What is the underlying logic? One explanation is ideological. Certain figures in and around this administration have long been more sympathetic to Moscow's worldview than Tehran's, for reasons that go deep into the intellectual and political roots of the current governing coalition. Another explanation is strategic. The administration genuinely believed that a short, decisive strike on Iran could produce regime change and a quick win. The administration believed that Iran was 1 or 2 weeks away from a nuclear weapon, that the US had no choice but to attack Iran, as it would inevitably attack the US after Israel attacked it, and that the opportunity of killing the Ayatollah was too good to pass up. But regime change has not happened. The Iranian regime is still standing, and now the United States finds itself in a war with no clear exit, rising costs, dead American soldiers, a global oil shock, and a Russia that is quietly feeding targeting intelligence to the enemy. Let us also talk about what this war has done to America's standing in the world, because that dimension is almost entirely absent from the domestic conversation. When the United States and Israel launched those strikes on February 28th, they said they aimed to induce regime change and target Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile program. But in doing so, Iran's counterstrikes hit more than a dozen countries in the region, including Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. Countries that had nothing to do with the decision to launch this war are now absorbing Iranian missile and drone strikes because they host American military assets or because they simply exist in the geography of the conflict. The United States did not ask those countries whether they were ready for this. It did not consult the governments of the people who now have Iranian missiles landing on their soil. It made a unilateral decision, and the region is paying the consequences alongside America and Europe. Most European governments initially responded with calls for restraint or respect for civilian lives and international law. The UK, historically America's closest ally, allowed US forces to use British military bases for a specific and limited defensive purpose, but made clear it was not participating in offensive strikes. German and French leaders signed a joint statement condemning Iranian counterstrikes, but also calling for diplomacy. The Western alliance, in other words, is fractured on this. America's traditional partners are not marching lockstep behind Washington on this one. And that fracturing matters enormously, because a world where even America's allies are skeptical of American judgment is a world where American power rests on a narrower and narrower foundation. Every time Washington acts without its partners, it erodes the legitimacy that makes American leadership possible. Now, back to Russia and back to what the phone call between Trump and Putin really means. According to officials briefed on the call, discussions ranged from potential frameworks for ending the Russia-Ukraine conflict to Moscow's position on the Iran operation. So let us think about what Putin now has in front of him. He has a United States that is militarily committed in the Middle East, economically exposed by oil price surges, diplomatically isolated from some of its traditional European partners, and coming to him hat in hand, asking for Russia's restraint on Iran, while simultaneously trying to negotiate a peace framework in Ukraine. Putin is negotiating from a position of enormous leverage right now. He has something Washington wants: Russian restraint in Iran. Washington has something Putin wants: a favorable peace settlement in Ukraine that locks in Russian territorial gains. You do not have to be a chess grandmaster to see what kind of bargaining dynamic that creates. And the American people, who have supported Ukraine's defense precisely because they believe principles matter and that great powers should not be allowed to simply invade and absorb their neighbors, those Americans may find that the war they did not vote for in Iran ends up costing them the principles they thought were being upheld in Ukraine. The global economics of this moment deserve more attention than they are getting. India, a major buyer of crude oil from the Persian Gulf, is especially vulnerable to the oil shortage, and the US Treasury Department issued a 30-day waiver to allow Indian refineries to purchase Russian oil that was previously under US sanctions. So America, to manage the secondary economic effects of a war it started, is now relaxing oil sanctions on Russia, the same Russia that is feeding targeting intelligence to Iran to help kill Americans. Russia benefits again. The sanctions architecture that was painstakingly built after the Ukraine invasion, the financial pressure that was supposed to constrain Russian aggression, is being quietly dismantled at the edges because the Iran war demands it. That is not a minor policy footnote. That is a fundamental unraveling of the economic strategy that was supposed to be holding Moscow accountable. And it is happening with almost no public discussion, no congressional debate, no acknowledgement from the administration that this is the price being paid. There are Americans dying in this war. 6 service members have lost their lives in the first week alone. The direct military cost of the war is difficult to estimate, but certainly in the billions of dollars. Polls show that a majority of Americans oppose this war, and yet it was started without a vote in Congress, without a full public debate, without the kind of national reckoning that a decision of this magnitude demands. Trump's decision to go it alone in Iran without a vote or even debate in Congress creates both constitutional problems and political challenges. The president chose not to offer a full discussion of this choice even in his State of the Union address, when he had the attention of the entire nation. That is not just a procedural problem, that is a democratic problem. Wars that are started without the consent of the governed, without the oversight of the legislature, without the transparency that allows citizens to hold their leaders accountable, those wars have a particular danger to them, not just the danger of the battlefield, but the danger of setting precedents. The precedent that a president can take America into a major war against a country of 90 million people with massive regional consequences on the basis of executive authority alone is a precedent that will outlast this administration and this conflict. Whoever comes next, whatever their politics, will have the power to do the same thing. That is the inheritance this moment is leaving. For Moscow, the normalization of preventive strikes against nuclear infrastructure erodes the diplomatic architecture that Russia once used to project influence and political legitimacy in the region. If the world accepts that the United States can simply bomb a country's nuclear program into rubble whenever Washington decides the diplomatic track is unsatisfying, what does that say to every other country that might want a nuclear deterrent? What does it say to North Korea? What does it say to countries that have been watching the Iran nuclear deal come apart for years and wondered whether diplomatic engagement with America was ever worth the paper it was written on? The message being sent right now to every government on earth that might one day find itself in Iran's position is this: do not negotiate, because negotiations can be abandoned whenever the other side finds them inconvenient. Build your deterrent fast, because it is the only thing that ultimately protects you from American military power. That is a devastating message to be sending, and the long-term consequences for global non-proliferation, for the project of keeping nuclear weapons from spreading, may be the most serious damage this war inflicts long after the bombs stop falling. And where does this leave ordinary Americans right now? It leaves them paying more for gas, watching their retirement accounts shrink with every market dip, sending their sons and daughters into a war that was never debated in their names, and being told by their government that Russia sharing intelligence with Iran to kill American troops is not making any difference. Everything is fine. We are winning. They are being asked to trust a set of decisions they were never asked to weigh in on, made by an administration that showed more patience with Vladimir Putin than with any diplomatic path that could have avoided this war. They are living through a moment where the so-called leader of the free world is dialing up an authoritarian in Moscow and asking him, please, please stay out of our war, while that same authoritarian's intelligence services are already inside it, pointing the coordinates of American warships to Iranian missile crews. That is the situation. That is the reality. And the American people deserve to say it plainly, understand it fully, and hold the people who made these choices fully, completely accountable.